Broncos Country. Today, we have two big Broncos stories to talk about, and both of them are connected by one uncomfortable reality. This roster is getting closer and closer to the point where some very difficult decisions have to be made. First, we need to talk about what could become the toughest roster cut on each side of the football. And this is exactly what happens when you build a roster with real competition. There are guys fighting for their NFL lives right now, and in some cases, playing well still might not be enough. One decision on offense and another on defense could be especially painful, because we are talking about players who have shown they can contribute. But when you are trying to build a 53-man roster capable of chasing a Super Bowl, somebody gets squeezed out. And I have to tell you, one of these potential cuts would be really tough for me to watch. Then, in our second story, we are going even deeper into this roster situation because 5 Broncos veterans could potentially become free agents on cutdown day. And there is an important difference here. These guys are not necessarily going through the same waiver process as younger players. If Denver decides there simply is not enough room, they could immediately have the opportunity to look somewhere else. That makes these final preseason games incredibly important, because the Broncos are not just deciding who makes the team, they could also be deciding which experienced players they are willing to risk losing. So yeah, Broncos Country, 2 stories today, and a lot to unpack, because we are getting to that part of the preseason where every snap feels a little heavier. And before we get into the first one, if you are enjoying these Broncos conversations, hit that like button and subscribe. I am Andrew, and this channel is still new. So our first goal is getting this Broncos community to 1,000 subscribers. But seriously, only subscribe if you are a real Broncos fan and you actually want to be here talking about this team with us. It would be pretty cool to look back someday and know you were part of this community from the very beginning. Alright, Broncos Country. Let us get into that first story. So, let us start with that first story, because roster cut season is getting very real in Denver. The Broncos are preparing to get this roster down to 53 players, and Travis Wakeman of Broncos Wire looked at what could be the most difficult projected cut on offense and the most difficult projected cut on defense. And on offense, the name he landed on is running back Jaleel McLaughlin. Now, this one would be tough. McLaughlin is exactly the kind of player fans can get attached to, because he works, he brings energy, and when his number is called, he can give this offense a spark. We just saw another example of that against the Atlanta Falcons, when he found the end zone in Denver's preseason win. But here is the problem. This is not necessarily about Jaleel McLaughlin not being good enough. It is about numbers. The Broncos brought Dobbins back this offseason on a 2-year contract, which was a little surprising considering everything else Denver already had going on at running back. Then you have RJ Harvey, and Denver also invested a 4th-round pick in former Washington running back Jonah Coleman. So when you start looking at Dobbins, Harvey, and Coleman together, you can understand why the Broncos might feel like they already have both the present and the future of this running back room covered. And that puts McLaughlin in a really uncomfortable position. Because at this stage of the roster, coaches are not only asking if this guy can run the football, they are asking what else he gives them. And that is where things become more difficult for McLaughlin. Pass protection has not been one of his strengths, and he does not contribute on special teams. Those are 2 important factors when you are fighting for one of the final roster spots. In fact, those limitations contributed to Tyler Beatty taking snaps away from McLaughlin during the 2025 season. And then, even though McLaughlin scored against Atlanta, he also lost a fumble in that game. You guys know how I feel about that. When you are sitting comfortably at the top of the depth chart, maybe one preseason fumble is something you correct and move on from. When you are fighting for your job, every mistake matters. Every single one. And that is what makes this situation frustrating. McLaughlin can play. Nobody is saying this guy has no ability. The question is whether he does enough of the other things Denver needs from a 4th running back to justify using one of those precious 53 roster spots, and right now it is difficult to see where that spot comes from. But if you think that decision is uncomfortable, we need to go to the defensive side, because Drew Sanders could be facing an equally difficult situation. Sanders also flashed against Atlanta. He recorded a sack, and those are exactly the kinds of plays you want to see from somebody battling to prove he still belongs in Denver's plans. The problem is that Sanders has spent a significant part of his career dealing with injuries. He came into the league as a 3rd-round pick with legitimate potential. But because he has not consistently been available, we really have not gotten a long enough look at what he can become. And this is where I think the Broncos' current situation matters so much. If this were a rebuilding team with time to develop everybody and wait for potential to become production, maybe the conversation would be different. But Denver is trying to win now. They are trying to build a roster they believe can compete for a Super Bowl, and when those are your expectations, availability matters. You need players you can count on. Then look at the competition Drew Sanders is dealing with at outside linebacker. Nick Bonito, Jonathan Cooper, Jonah Ellis's Dondria, Tillman, Q Robinson, those guys are all projected as likely roster members. And suddenly you start doing the math and realize just how difficult Sanders' path becomes. And this is where cutting Sanders would carry another risk. Because if Denver lets him go, there is a very realistic possibility another NFL team looks at his draft pedigree, sees the athletic ability and the untapped potential, and decides they can work with that. So Denver could potentially watch Sanders go somewhere else and finally put everything together. Nobody wants that. But the Broncos also have to ask themselves a difficult question. How much longer can they afford to wait? That is the brutal part of building a deep roster. Sometimes a player does not get cut because he is terrible. Sometimes he gets cut because the guys around him give the team more certainty. Right now, and for McLaughlin and Sanders, these remaining preseason opportunities are enormous. Now, that brings us perfectly into our second story, because those two names are far from the only Broncos players facing uncertainty. Bob Morris of Sports Illustrated's Mile High Huddle highlighted 5 Broncos veterans who could be sitting on the roster bubble. And there is an important technical difference with these 5 players. When most younger players are left off the 53-man roster, they are placed on waivers, meaning another NFL team has an opportunity to claim them before Denver could potentially bring them back onto the practice squad. But once a player has accrued his 4th NFL season, he can be released outright rather than going through waivers. An accrued season generally means spending at least 6 games on full pay status, whether that is on the 53-man roster, injured reserve, or under the applicable circumstances, the physically unable to perform list. So these veterans could become free agents immediately if Denver releases them. They would be free to negotiate with another team. Although they could also return to Denver's practice squad once the 53-man rosters are finalized. And the first name here is wide receiver Lil Jordan Humphrey. Humphrey has 6 accrued seasons and has been around the Broncos for part or all of the last 3 seasons. He has spent plenty of time on the practice squad, but Broncos fans have also seen him get opportunities through game day elevations and when injuries open spots. And there are 2 reasons Sean Payton keeps this guy around. He knows the system, and he can block. Humphrey's familiarity with Payton matters, and his willingness to do the dirty work as a blocker gives him value that does not always show up when people are just looking at receiving numbers. Still, the numbers game hits him too. The projection here is that Humphrey probably needs Denver to carry 6 wide receivers to have a strong chance of making the initial 53. If Denver goes in another direction, though Humphrey feels like a very logical candidate to return on the practice squad, assuming, of course, another opportunity does not convince him to leave. The second veteran is offensive lineman Matt Peart, and Peart's situation is really interesting. He originally signed with Denver in 2024 on a 1-year contract to serve as the swing tackle. The Broncos then gave him a 2-year extension but he missed most of the 2025 season because of injury, and his salary for 2026 was later renegotiated. Now he is fighting for his roster spot. Frank Crum is part of this competition, and undrafted rookie Tyler Miller helped himself by playing well in the preseason opener. So if Denver decides it likes what it has in Crum and Miller and finds ways to retain both of them, Peart could be the odd man out. And of these 5 veterans, Peart may actually be the one most likely to move on entirely if he is released. That tells you how quickly things can change in the NFL. You can sign an extension 1 year and find yourself fighting for a roster spot not long after. The third name is quarterback Sam Ehlinger. Ehlinger has 5 accrued seasons. He signed with Denver in 2025 and spent time both on the practice squad and the active roster. Then he chose to re-sign with the Broncos during the offseason, but the preseason opener against Atlanta gave us a pretty strong indication of where the backup quarterback battle stands. Jarrett Stidham appears to have a firm grip on the number 2 quarterback job. And if Denver feels comfortable with Stidham behind the starter, Keeping Ellinger on the 53 could become difficult to justify when that roster spot might be needed at another position. But there is another side to this one. Ellinger has indicated that he enjoys playing for this coaching staff. So if he is released, there seems to be a reasonable possibility he would be willing to return on the practice squad. And for a quarterback who already knows what Sean Payton wants offensively, that could make a lot of sense for both sides. The fourth player is safety Tycen Anderson, who has 4 accrued seasons. Denver signed Anderson as a free agent this offseason, with the expectation that he could provide safety depth while helping on special teams. Against Atlanta, he did not necessarily jump off the screen defensively, but he did some good things on special teams. And when you are battling for those final roster spots, special teams can absolutely be the difference. Of these 5 veterans, Anderson is viewed as the safest bet to make the 53. I would be somewhat surprised if Denver moved on from him, but it is not guaranteed. His next preseason performances matter, and a big part of the decision could simply come down to whether Denver chooses to keep 5 safeties. If Anderson does get cut, there is also no guarantee he decides to stick around on the practice squad. As a veteran free agent, he could look around the league and see whether there is a better opportunity somewhere else. And finally, we have offensive guard Calvin Throckmorton. Throckmorton has 4 accrued seasons and has spent multiple years around Denver's practice squad, with occasional elevations to the active roster. And just like Humphrey, there is familiarity here. Throckmorton originally played for the New Orleans Saints, so Sean Payton knows him well. But what really helped Throckmorton recently was versatility. He took a significant number of snaps at center in the preseason opener against Atlanta, and he handled those responsibilities well. That matters. When you are talking about backup offensive linemen, versatility can save your job because the Broncos can only dedicate so many roster spots to the offensive line. If one guy can reliably cover multiple positions, suddenly he becomes much easier to keep. So Throckmorton absolutely has a path to the active roster. But if Denver simply cannot make the numbers work, he is another veteran who could potentially return to the practice squad. So when we look at all 5 names together, Lil Jordan, Humphrey, Matt Peart, Sam Ellinger, Tycen Anderson, and Calvin Throckmorton, Anderson looks like the strongest bet to survive cutdown day and make the 53. Humphrey, Ellinger, and Throckmorton make plenty of sense as potential practice squad players if they do not make the initial roster. Though we absolutely cannot rule out one or more of them winning a spot on the 53. Peart appears to be in the most dangerous position, particularly because of what is happening with Denver's offensive line competition. And Broncos Country. When you combine this second story with what we talked about earlier with Jaleel McLaughlin and Drew Sanders, I think it tells us something important about where this team is right now. Denver has some genuinely painful decisions coming, and believe it or not, that is actually something we have wanted to see. For years, we have talked about wanting this roster to become deeper. We have wanted competition. We have wanted the Broncos to reach the point where making the 53 actually means beating out another NFL caliber player. Well, here we are. The downside is that players we like are going to leave. McLaughlin could do everything asked of him and still lose a numbers game. Sanders could flash that potential again and still find himself on the outside because Denver simply has too many options ahead of him. Veterans like Humphrey, Peart, Ellinger, Anderson, and Throckmorton could have their futures determined by 1 or 2 roster spots. And that is why these remaining preseason games matter. This is not just meaningless August football for these guys. These snaps could decide jobs. They could decide who stays in Denver, who lands on the practice squad, and who puts on another uniform. And if the Broncos truly believe this team is ready to chase a Super Bowl, Sean Payton and this front office cannot make these decisions based on sentiment. They have to build the best 53-man roster possible. That does not mean every decision will be right. We might watch somebody get released, sign somewhere else, and play great football. That happens. But Denver has reached a point where potential alone cannot guarantee you a roster spot. And personally, as painful as some of these cuts could be, I will take this kind of problem. Give me a Broncos roster where good football players are fighting just to survive cutdown day. Give me competition. Give me difficult decisions. Because if this team has the expectations we think it does, that standard has to be high. Now, I want to hear from you, Broncos Country. Out of Jaleel McLaughlin and Drew Sanders, which potential cut would bother you more? And looking at Lil Jordan, Humphrey, Matt Peart, Sam Ellinger, Tycen Anderson, and Calvin Throckmorton, Who are you absolutely keeping on the 53? Drop your opinion in the comments because I really want to see where Broncos fans stand on these decisions. And if you enjoyed talking Broncos with me today, hit the like button. This channel is still new, and we are chasing that first goal of 1,000 subscribers together. So if you genuinely believe in the future of the Broncos and want to be part of this community from the beginning, subscribe and stick around. Because these decisions are coming fast, Broncos country. And something tells me we are going to have a whole lot to talk about.